Matthew 28. Want to encourage you just a couple things. Number one, if you're in any way can make it Wednesday night to the C3, that's always an incredible time of worship, and we have a great time. It's combined campus celebration. We'll have all of our services together under one roof, and it's just an awesome time. And then next week, we're starting a new sermon series based on 1 Corinthians chapter 7, and the subtitle of the series is Marriage, Sex, and Singleness. So that ought to get you back next week and to bring a friend with you. It's going to be a great 4 weeks as we look at that series. I had an awesome time on my sabbatical. I'll share more about it in the coming weeks. I spent a weekend out with our launch team out in Utah. They're doing great. But I was able to go back to my old church in Birmingham in Hoover because I had to be up there for something else. And so I went to church there a couple of weeks ago and hanging out with some friends, and they reminded me of this. I thought I'd give you a little insight into your pastor. While I was there, they reminded me of what we had done. When I was on staff there, I was the executive pastor, and I preached at our satellite campus. But we used to tease our worship pastor. And by the way, our worship pastor's name was Bubba. You know you're in Alabama when the worship pastor's name is Bubba. Okay? So he was our worship pastor, and we used to tease him and say, man, if you want revival in the church, just let Chuck sing, right? And I had talked to all of our staff, and we would constantly tell him, man, if you just let Chuck sing, we're going to have revival in the church. Is that me? That just me? Yeah. Am I running out of battery or what?
It's the connection.
It's the connection. All right, I'm going to get rid of this. How's that? Okay. Let's go with this one, Jason. So we went on staff retreat while I was there, and we went down to Gulf Shores, Alabama. We had a condo right on the beach. It was and we were on like the 5th floor. And so we'd been teasing Bubba about this for man, if you just let Chuck sing, he'll feel the whole deal. So we got up, we had a couple of us get up real early one morning because we had morning devotions. We had a time set, and Bubba had claimed the balcony that looked over the ocean. And so that was his place for his morning devotion. So we got up real early, went out to the beach, brought some tools with us, and in the beach we wrote in big bold letters, "Let Chuck sing," right? We thought if Bubba gets a word from God, he's got to let me sing. And so we put that in the beach that morning. We went back up, and then we got some coffee, woke Bubba up like we had just gotten all up and all. And so we saw Bubba go out with his Bible and his devotional out onto the balcony, and we're thinking, okay, this is cool. He goes out, and just a couple seconds later, he says, guys, you got to come out and see this. So we knew what we were looking at, right? So we go out, we look over the balcony, except here's what we didn't know. The tide was coming in. And so because the tide was coming in, it took the G off of sing. And there in big bold letters, "Let Chuck sin." It was the end of my ministry there. After that, I had to leave. Today, we're going to look at our 4th value as a church. And a value is something that gives priority to our mission. Now, we know the purpose of our church is to help people be the church. What does that mean? It's a reminder that we're called to be salt and light every place we go. That church is not some place we come to. Church is something that we are. That we leave here on mission to go out and to bring the good news to the people around us. That we're to love the unlovable. That we're to bring encouragement to those who are discouraged. That we're to serve others. And so we know that it's to be the church. That what we do here is preparing us for tomorrow and for the rest of the week to actually live out our faith. We also know that we do that, equip ourselves through the 4B process, that we first of all need to believe in God and understand what that means. And today is our B class. Right after this service, we'll feed you lunch. If you've never joined the church or want to find out what we believe, we'll feed your kids lunch, and we'll be out of here by 1:15, 1:30. The Believe class, the belong class, that God's called us community, that we're to be involved in a community of believers, to become a disciple that we're going to look at today, and then to live beyond ourselves, and that is to have a purpose in life that we understand this is how God has shaped us, this is what he made me for, and I'm to live out that purpose in my life. And so today we're looking at our fourth value, and it's that every member is a missionary. Every member is a missionary. And where do we get that from? Well, we get it from the last words that Jesus gave the church before he ascended into heaven. The first, we're going to look today in Matthew 28, and you're going to see those words there. But if you were to look at the other place, it's in Acts 1:8 that we looked at earlier this year, where Jesus said, "You're to be my witnesses in Jerusalem, Judea, and Samaria, and to the ends of the earth." If you were to look at Acts 1:8 and Matthew 28, those are the final marching instructions to the church. And today I want us to look at Matthew 28. And it's a familiar passage, and so I want us to go in a little bit deeper, because sometimes a passage gets so familiar that it really loses its power. And so I want us to really examine what's going on here. So I want us to pick up in verse 16 of Matthew 28. It says, "Then the 11 disciples went to Galilee." First of all, why were there 11? Because Judas had betrayed Christ. He had hung himself. They had not replaced Judas yet. So these are the original 11 disciples. They went to Galilee to meet with Jesus, to the mountain where Jesus had told them to go. In fact, Jesus had told some women in verse 10, look, Jesus told them, then Jesus said to these women, "Do not be afraid. Go and tell my brothers to go to Galilee. There they will see me." So they went and told the disciples, Jesus is going to meet you in Galilee on this mountain. That's where they were. And it says when they saw him, they worshiped him, but some doubted. Now that bothered me for a long time. How could they see Jesus? But here's what's going on there. It says when they saw him, they worshiped him. And then it's really kind of a bad translation. It doesn't mean that they didn't believe it. Here's what it means. It meant that it was almost too good to be true. Have you ever seen something or experienced something when you said, "I can't believe that," right? It's there, it's empirical, you know it's happening, but it's just beyond comprehension. Well, that's what's going on with disciples. I can't believe that I'm seeing Jesus. They're not doubting Jesus. It's just a way of expressing that it's beyond their belief. And then Jesus said to them, it says verse 18, then Jesus came to them and said. Now, sometimes, again, we can just pass over something. But think about this. It says that Jesus came to them and said. Jesus was dead a few days earlier. And now he's standing up talking to them. How much do you think he had their attention? In fact, what would happen if a dead person, somebody you knew was dead, came and showed up and started talking to you? Right? Now, we would listen to everything they said. We may not do it. You know, there's that whole test the spirits thing and am I awake and all of those things. But here, Jesus is standing in front of them. The guy that they had followed for 3 years. They saw him crucified, buried, and now he's standing in front of them and he's giving them instruction. And he starts off by just saying, look, all authority in heaven and earth has been given to me. Here's what Jesus is saying. My word is authoritative. That what I tell you is the truth. And what Jesus is reminding us there is that he has authority to proclaim, that what he proclaims, he has the power to see it through. And it's a reminder that there is no authority in heaven or earth greater than that of his. His authority is greater than any earthly institution or person. Which means that as Christians, as Christ followers, we don't take our cues from the culture. We don't take our cues from the government. The world doesn't tell us what's right and wrong, but we let Jesus speak into our lives because he has all the authority. And he says to them, therefore,
go and make disciples of all nations. And that's what I want us to look at this morning. Go and make disciples of all nations. He goes on to say, here's what it's going to look like. You're going to baptize them, then you're going to teach them to be disciples. But here's my calling to you. He says, I want you to go and make disciples. And understand, as you look at those verses, here's what you need to understand. He's giving that commission to that 11, yes, but he's giving it to the church. Which means he is speaking to us this morning as clearly as he was to those original 11. And he's giving us our commission. You know what's crazy? A few days later, just a little while later, he ascends into heaven, and they actually did what he told them to do. They immediately started living differently because of his authority and his commission on their lives. And they started doing what he told them to do, so much so that we call the early Christians disciples. Why? Because a disciple listens to what the teacher says and then does what they're told. If you're a Christian, you're called to be a disciple and then to go make other disciples. Understand, your salvation is not primarily about punching a ticket to heaven, even though that's a promise and we'll go to heaven. Your salvation is not primarily about becoming a better person and just being a nice guy or gal, even though our behavior should change when we become believers. Jesus is saying at the core of what it means to be my follower is that you're a disciple. And I'm calling you as a disciple to go and make disciples. Well, what is a disciple? Well, a disciple is somebody who thinks like Jesus thought and does what Jesus did. And you'll never be a disciple if you don't spend time in his word and know what the Bible teaches. And that's why disciples spend time daily in his word. And then here's what a disciple does. If the Bible says to do it, we go and live it. And in doing so, we will see our lives make a difference. So every member, we say in the church, should be on a mission. Well, what does that mission look like? It looks like the mission of Jesus. But I want to give us 4 things today to think about being on mission and being a disciple. First of all, in your notes, a missionary is first of all an imitator of Christ. A missionary is first of all an imitator of Christ. Paul says, be imitators of God, therefore, as dearly loved children, and live a life of love, just as Christ loved us and gave himself up for us as a fragrant offering and a sacrifice to God. The early disciples, they followed Jesus and they did what Jesus said. Even during Jesus' ministry, Jesus sent 72 ahead and he said, go to these towns and villages and here's what I want you to do. I want you to preach the good news. I want you to heal the sick. I want you to do these things. And they just obeyed and did what Jesus told them to do. Jesus said it another way in John 14. He said this, he says, whoever has my commands and obeys them, he is the one who loves me. And he who loves me will be loved by my Father, and I too will love him and show myself to him. Notice what it said. It said, whoever has my commands and obeys them, that's the disciple. I say this, and it gets some people upset, but I'll keep saying it. Sometimes the last thing we need is another Bible study. What we need to do is start living out what we already know. Can I get an amen? Because most of us in the room are educated far beyond our obedience level. And it's not about gaining a lot of knowledge as much as it is about living out what we know we ought to be doing. And the more we do that, the more we'll understand and the more we'll learn. But it really, you cannot take understanding and obedience. You cannot separate the two. So Christians are disciples and they do what Jesus said to do. And a big part of that is to live on mission and obey the Great Commission. Jesus had a mission. In fact, Jesus gives us his one-line mission statement in Luke chapter 19. He says this, for the Son of Man came to seek and to save what is lost. In that one line, he's given us his mission statement. I came to seek and save that which is lost. And that comes after he has told these three parables. Jesus in Luke 15 is told a parable of a shepherd with some sheep, a lady with some coins, and a man with some boys. He said a shepherd had 100 sheep, and one of the sheep went missing. And the shepherd had an all-out search to find that sheep. When he found that sheep and came back, he called his friends together, and they celebrated the fact that he found the sheep. His next parable, he said there was a lady who had 10 coins. She lost a coin. She turned the house upside down on a frantic search for the coin. When she found the coin, she called her friends over. They celebrated the fact that she found the coin. The last story is about a son who was lost. He left the father, went out to do his own thing, lived for the world. And it says when he came to his senses, he came back to the father. When he came back to the father called his friends, and they had a celebration that the son had returned. Now take those parables and flip them, and let's go backwards. If you had two sons and one was missing, you do everything you could to find the other son. If you had 10 coins and you lost a coin, especially these were valuable coins, you would do a lot of looking around the house to find the coin because it represents 10%. But let me ask you, if you were a shepherd and one sheep out of 100 was gone, and why? Look, we don't know why it was gone. It may be because of a bear, or maybe because a lion got him, and to go out and find that sheep may put yourself in harm. How many would say, you know what, 99 out of 100 is pretty good? You're going to lose a sheep every once in a while. But why did Jesus tell that parable that way? Because here's what he's saying. The guy who had the 100 and lost one was just as concerned about the one as the man who had 2 and lost 1. Why? Because everybody matters to God. And God doesn't want to see any of his children lost. And that's what he's teaching in this parable. And then he says this, he says, oh, and by the way, there is rejoicing in the presence of the angels of God when over one sinner who repents. And what Jesus is teaching is that, look, my ministry is to seek and save those who are lost, and every one of the lost matters. And God rejoices, and there is a celebration in heaven whenever one of these lost are found. And that's been God's plan all along. It's amazing how we complicate the Christian life. And we debate and argue over things that ultimately really don't matter. And Jesus said, here was my mission. If you're going to be a disciple, it's your mission. Seek and save those who are lost. In fact, the very first disciples, here's how he called them. They were fishermen. They were uneducated fishermen. He goes up to them and says, follow me and I will make you fishers of men. In other words, I got a mission for you. That you're no longer going to fish for fish. Now you're going to fish for men. Why? Because there's a lot of fish missing. And I want you guys to help find them. You notice he didn't go to those first disciples and say, follow me and I'll guarantee you a spot in heaven. Even though that's true, he didn't go to those first disciples and say, follow me and I will make you a better moral person, even though that's true. He didn't say, follow me and I'll put you in some incredible worship experiences that lift your spirit, even though that's true, especially here this morning. What did he say? He said, follow me. I'm going to make you a disciple. Follow me and I'm going to make you fishers of men. But here's the truth. You can't reproduce something that you aren't. Disciples reach disciples. And if you aren't a disciple, you can't make disciples. You must first be an imitator of Jesus and let his word guide you on how to live, and then obey what his word says. Somebody on mission is an imitator of Christ. Secondly, somebody on mission understands they have an incarnational ministry. Now, I worked hard to find 4 eyes, so hang in there, all right? Because as a preacher, you got to alliterate. It's got to be the same. But incarnational. Here's what we say: Jesus was the incarnate God. What does that mean? It means he left heaven and came to earth. That he was physically among us. John 1:14. The Word became flesh and dwelt among us. And in Jesus' mission to reach the world, he was going to have to come to the world to reach the world. He came and he ministered to the world and lived among us. His first public miracle was at a wedding. And he walked around, and as he walked around, he was the church in our vernacular. He lived out. In fact, he did his greatest ministry during the week as he was just walking along. He would heal a blind man. He would give encouragement to somebody who needed encouraging. He would teach the truth, and he would perform miracles. In fact, when you look at the ministry of Jesus, if he was in church, things really probably were going to go bad. Because when he went to church, when he went to the temple or the synagogue, he was usually dealing with religious people who didn't get the mission. And it was when he was actually among the people that you see his greatest ministry happen. And why? Because here's what Jesus understood. He couldn't stay in heaven and reach the world. He couldn't stay in heaven and save the world. He had to come and live among us in order to go to the cross for us. And here's what it means for us. We can't sit in church and expect to reach the world. And sure, we come to church, we're called to gather each week, and we're to bring people with us that we want them to hear the good news. But the real ministry happens when we walk out of here. That's really when we have an opportunity to let our light shine and to live on mission. The third I is indigenous. And all this means is that you understand the culture and you adopt the message to the culture. Let me say this. We will never change the message, but our methods better change on a regular basis. I was thinking about this morning. This up here shows 57 members in 1967. We've made it to 1997 with 1,400, almost 1,500 members in the church. And just think about how differently we did ministry in 1967 than we do today, right? All that means is that you understand the culture and you adopt the message to the culture. Jesus came in a Jewish culture and ministered primarily in a Jewish culture. Paul was called to be a missionary to the Gentiles. And so he did things differently. In fact, in 1 Corinthians 9, he kind of gives the list about how he did things differently. He said, look, if I'm ministering, if I'm trying to reach those who are under the law, talking about the Jews, I'll do things one way. But if I'm trying to reach those outside of the law who have no law, he's just talking about the Gentiles, he says, I'm going to do ministry differently to reach those outside of the law. And to be indigenous is to strategically say, who is it we're trying to reach and what's the best way to reach them? How do we remove barriers that keep people from coming to Jesus? And so it's why we're going to do things differently in Utah than we do them here. Look, the ministry in Utah is going to look a little bit different than the ministry in Central Florida. Why? Because the county where our church is going to plant a campus is 90+% Mormon. And the culture is different. And if we want to be effective and reach that culture, we're going to have to do things a little bit differently to reach them. It's why I don't preach the Brazilian service. Right? Indigenous means you get a guy who knows the Brazilian culture to preach the Brazilian service. And so, Pastor Leshu, he's Brazilian. And so if we want to reach Brazilians, the wise thing to do is to get Brazilians to reach Brazilians. And in fact, we have a whole lot different. There's a lot of things I'm still learning about the Brazilian culture. Let me give you a couple examples. Right before, in the middle of May, I was holding my 2 grandsons, and Troy took a picture of me, and when he did, it looked like I was 3 months pregnant, okay? Now, I'm blaming it on the fact that I had grandkids that were pushing it out, okay? But I determined that day I was going to lose some weight. So I've lost 21 pounds since that picture, and not done yet. So I came back after sabbatical. I hadn't been here for 4 weeks, and last week people would come up to me and said, Chuck, you've lost some weight. Man, you look good. Chuck, you've lost some weight. You look good. I came to the Brazilian service last Sunday night. Here's what they said. Chuck, Pastor, you've lost some weight. Are you okay? I mean, just totally different, they thought I was sick, right? Just totally different culture. In fact, not long ago, when Lester came on our staff, we were sitting there and he goes, Pastor, Brazilians love to eat. And so we want to eat after church. And so we want to have the lobby. I said, well, absolutely. I said, you're Baptist. We love to eat, right? Let's do that. He said, yeah, because we get together after church. We have cocktails. Yeah, that's what I thought. Now, that may be an outreach strategy, but I don't know how it's going to fly with the elders. Okay, you're telling me after church you have cocktails. Well, here's what I came to understand. In the Brazilian culture, all cocktails means is refreshments. There's no alcohol involved in cocktails in the Brazilian. So it's indigenous. You have to have people who understand the culture to reach the culture. It's why we have a little kid preaching the other services, right? Why? Because we wanted to reach millennials. We wanted to be serious about reaching the millennials and not just talking about it. So we changed the worship. Why do you change the worship? Because the kind of worship that speaks to millennials is different than the kind of worship that speaks to my generation. And that's why we brought in Marcio, 35 years old, right, to preach that service. Why? Because he's a millennial, and he understands millennials. There's some things I understand about millennials, but I didn't get a trophy for every sport I played in. So there's some things I don't understand about millennials. Okay? Well, all it means is really that we need to be strategic in the way that we carry out the mission. And so we want to be indigenous. And then lastly, we need to be intentional. Notice what Jesus said, man, as the Father has sent me, I'm sending you. Jesus saying, as intentional as I am about my mission, I'm not telling you that you need to be that intentional about the mission I've given you. When I was in Birmingham, I actually was able to go to my old church, but I did that because I went up there for a different reason, and that was to go to a conference at a church up there, the Church of the Highlands, which is one of the largest churches in America that actually has solid doctrine, okay? And they're incredibly solid. They run about 45,000 on the weekend on about 10 campuses. And they're just amazing what God's doing in that church and through that. And Chris Hodges is their pastor, and Chris was sharing a story. He said, I have 6 kids. And he said, my youngest son is autistic. And I knew this about Chris. And so I understand that. And he said, my youngest son is autistic. He said, we had 4 families go skiing together a couple years ago. They went out to Breckenridge, Colorado, and said, we skied for 3 days. But on the 4th day, we said, you know what? Let's not ski today. Let's just do the whole town. Let's just start on one end, work all the way up, come back down. Breckenridge is a beautiful town. Let's just spend the day on the town. So they did that. They kind of slept in. Their first stop was a Starbucks. At the beginning of the town, they stopped in, and man, they all poured in there, and they ordered their coffee and all, and said once everybody got their coffee and their drinks, they walked out, and they're going to walk the town, but as soon as they walked out, there on the left was a Cold Stone Creamery, and they thought, what better way to start a day than, ice cream and coffee? And so they all piled into the Stone Cold Creamery. What they didn't know was when they left the Starbucks to go to the creamery, Josh, who is Chris's youngest son, who's autistic, was in the men's room. And he walks out, and he doesn't see anybody. And he walks out of the Starbucks, and instead of taking a left to the Cold Stone Creamery, he took a right. Well, Chris tells the story. It's almost like Jesus at the temple. There were so many people there that it took about 10 minutes for him to realize Josh wasn't in the room. And he said, where's Josh? And nobody knew where Josh was. He ran next door to Starbucks and came back into the Cold Stone Creamery and said, look, Josh just isn't there. There's nowhere to be found. He said he didn't have to say another word. He said 25, 30 people immediately just split up and went in 25, 30 different directions. looking for Josh. He said, I took off down a street and got several blocks down, and there was a policeman just leaning against his car drinking a cup of coffee. And he said, sir, I've lost my son. You need to help me find him. Said the policeman just kind of stood there and said, well, you'll find him. He'll turn up. He said, no, you don't understand. He's autistic. He has no clue what's going on. You need to help me find my son. And said the policeman just didn't get it. And he was just so easy and said, well, where did you lose him? And how do you know he's lost? And could he be with somebody else? And he's asking all of these questions. And Chris is saying, look, you've got to get on that radio and you've got to let everybody know that he's lost and we need to find my son. And he said it was like this policeman just never got it. Just never got it. And he said, this didn't happen, but imagine what would happen if while I was still there, somebody would have come up to me and said, you know, Chris, you got 6 kids. You lose one, you still got 5. I mean, isn't that enough? Isn't 5 kids enough? Do you really need all 6? He said, if anybody would have told me that, it would have gone bad. And he said, you know, I have 5 other kids. What if one of my other kids came up to me and said, you know, Dad, what are we having for dinner tonight? Or can I have money to go to the movie? Or what if they'd have been thinking about something other than the fact that Josh was missing? Said it would have been a bad day. Said they didn't, but what if they would have? He said, I just kind of gave up on the policeman, went around a couple blocks down. I saw Josh a few blocks away standing on a bridge, and he was standing there confused and crying. He said, I ran up to him, we embraced. And he said, here's the image that came to mind. God is in heaven looking down on earth, and he has lost sons and daughters. And he's told the church, I'm commissioning you to go out and find the lost and to bring them to me. And we in the church are kind of acting like that police officer. In many ways, we could be like one of the children if they really would have and said, you know, instead of being focused on the mission, here's what we do. You know, God, that music was just too loud today. They need to do something about that. Or God, why can't they have the service a little bit earlier? Because I really need to get out and do something. And that other, I can't go to that other service because the music's too different for me. Or God, I couldn't find a place to park today. Said, we're complaining about things that God could care less about, because he's got children who are missing. And he's commissioned us, his church, to be on mission, to tell them about his love for them. Because that's what disciples do. Let's pray. Father, I thank you for this church, and I thank you for how many in this church understand this truth. But God, we many times don't live with the urgency that we should. God, I pray for anybody in the room today who maybe they don't know you as their Father. They couldn't disciple because they're not a disciple. And I pray that God, maybe through the power of worship, maybe through the truth that we've looked at today, that God, you're drawing them. Today's the day that they say yes to you, and God, give fully to you their lives and to live for you from this day forward. And God, for all of us, sometimes we can get our eyes off of the real mission, and we can get distracted by things that ultimately, in the end, really don't matter. And Lord, I pray that we would, God, that we would all be disciples. That we would understand that you've called us to be fishers of men. You've called us to be the church and live in such a way that lost people can be found. And God, when that happens, just like there is rejoicing in heaven, we will rejoice over everyone that you allow us to be a part of your process of bringing them to you. And so, God, as we walk out today, we walk out as missionaries. God, to go and be the church and make a difference. Help us to be in your word daily. Help us to live according to your word. And it's in Jesus' precious name we pray. Amen.